A dramatic courtroom apology to the family of one of Whitey Bulger's alleged victims. Plus, we tour South Boston to see how much has changed since Bulger's days in the hood. A tragedy in Arizona is hitting home across the country.
These are the worst of times for firefighters.
And pilot Patrick Smith clears up some common misconceptions about air travel. Now on Greater Boston. Good evening. I'm Gail Huff in for Emily Rooney. Watching the Whitey Bulger trial has been a little like reading an intricately written crime novel. There are details, there is testimony. Each side builds its case, often without emotion. What can be forgotten in the day-to-day proceedings is the effect that Bulger's drug dealing had on South Boston. Michael Patrick MacDonald wrote about that in his 1999 bestseller, All Souls. We asked him to take us back to the old neighborhood where Whitey still looms large. The brick walls are cracked, the streets dirty, overrun with trash. Old Harbor housing project in South Boston looks almost exactly like it did when James Whitey Bulger grew up here in the 30s and 40s. Michael Patrick MacDonald was a little baby when Whitey started selling drugs in his neighborhood. As a kid living in the projects, who was Whitey Bulger in the neighborhood?
Everyone understood that he was like the person in charge of everything. For a lot of people, he was a kind of a father figure. For my older brothers, he would have been looked up to as, the greatest thing that you could possibly become.
His older brothers wouldn't live to see Michael grow up. He lost 4 siblings to drugs and violence in Southeast projects, and he blames Whitey and his enablers.
He was the cause of a lot of people's deaths in the neighborhood, not just the 19 murders that he's on trial for, but a whole generation being wiped out by the drug trade that he sat at the helm of.
During the day, Whitey could be found right across the street from the housing project in the South Boston Liquor Mart that he owned. This is where he forced local bars to purchase their alcohol. It's also where he collected debts.
I mean, the cocaine was just overflowing here. I mean, you just saw it everywhere.
And that's something that Whitey was bringing in?
That was something that he, his defense team has even acknowledged that he was at the head of in this neighborhood. There was a huge green shamrock painted on the side over there, and just emblematic that this was the center of the Irish Mafia in South Boston.
Several blocks away on G Street, Whitey recruited teens from South Boston High School, where he was a dropout.
We had some of the highest dropout rates in the city of Boston. What that meant was a lucrative drug trade for Whitey Bulger. That meant a population that would be either doing drugs or be easily recruited into some of the illegal operations, whether it was the bank robberies or the truck hijackings or dealing.
By night, Whitey could be found barely a mile away at the Triple O's Lounge on West Broadway. Across from a Starbucks, it's now a sushi bistro, symbolic of the new gentrified Southie.
People would come from everywhere else at about 1:45 in the morning before closing time to get their drugs.
The tour ends on Southie's waterfront, where the Moakley Courthouse was built during the 16 years that Whitey was on the lam. Fittingly, he's right back in his hometown neighborhood.
Whitey Bulger looks incredibly frail. He looks like an 83-year-old man that I can't really even attach to the figure that we all had in our heads as this kind of guardian of the neighborhood.
And MacDonald is sitting in on the entire trial.
I'm there to see how the government is narrowing the narrative of this case to be about one bad guy, as opposed to the fact that this was a huge operation that involved a lot of agents in very high places at all levels of law enforcement, politicians, and not to mention a lot of the people that knew what was going on in this neighborhood and looked the other way.
And now in court, their stories are finally being told, with some of the lies being exposed for the first time. Joining us is Dick Lehr, a former Globe reporter who's been writing about the Bulger saga for over a decade. His latest book is Whitey, The Life of America's Most Notorious Mob Boss. So welcome. Thanks for joining us. You've been sitting in on a lot of this.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it's a must-see if you've been working on it like I have for so many years as a journalist.
What is it like to actually sit in that courtroom for you, having covered it for so many years, just to see him for the first time?
Yeah, it's something like what Patrick MacDonald was talking about, because you had, from the distance as a reporter, an image of him in your head all these years, and by virtue of all that he's done, all the harm, all the murder, all the mayhem he's behind, and indeed, he's just another old guy at this point, but clearly with a mean streak still in him.
You know, one of the things they talk about a lot is the fact that he doesn't show a whole lot of emotion in court.
Right.
But I guess we have seen a little bit of emotion
Yeah, he's been
lately.
waking up a little bit, because I think it's hard for him to sit still. He's used to being in charge and in control. And I think even though he spent so many years wearing a mask of Charlie Gasco in Santa Monica, as, you know, hiding in plain sight as a retiree, the true Whitey bubbles out here and there, just as it did in Santa Monica. You know, Gail, I have to say that, you know, the Patrick MacDonald stuff is really powerful. And he reminds me that the media in Boston really missed a story in the 1980s that he lived and experienced, which was that drugs were rampant in South Boston, tearing it apart. And yet the public's view of Whitey Bulger during the 80s, through the Boston media, my paper included, was that Whitey Bulger was this sort of Robin Hood figure, because we were basing our reporting not on good street reporting and maybe perhaps talking to people like Michael, but based on our reporting with John Conley, Whitey's FBI handler, who we all know now was so corrupt. And here he was spinning the myth of Whitey to reporters, unknowingly and unwittingly, but we're turning it around and putting it in the paper, and we were missing a big story on the ground.
It's scary, dramatic, too, when you see the kind of day that they had in court today. John Morris, the disgraced former FBI supervisor, wrapping up his testimony today when he became very emotional, looking directly at the family of one of Bulger's alleged victims. Morris apologized for, quote, "things I did and I didn't do. I do not ask for forgiveness, that's too much, but I do acknowledge it publicly." Now, joining our conversation, of course, Adam Riley as well, and you've been sitting in on this trial all along as well, Adam.
Indeed,
so.
Yeah, it was a pretty intense moment. I think there's some question about the authenticity of the contrition that John Morris put on display today. Just to give people context, they might need to process his apology. There was a man named Brian Halloran who was working as an FBI informant, and John Morris, disgraced former FBI supervisor who worked closely with John Connolly, leaked the fact that he was, in fact, an FBI informant. He was an associate of the Winter Hill Gang, and this ultimately led to his death. I think, please feel free to jump in if I'm getting the details wrong. So today, Hank Brennan, one of Bulger's attorneys, was trying to kind of prod Morris and challenge this idea that he was racked with guilt for the things that he's done over the years. And he said, have you ever apologized to either the family of Brian Halloran or the family of Michael Donahue, who happened to be giving Halloran a ride home on the night that he was killed and was killed himself? And Morris said, no, I haven't. And then Brennan sort of gestured at Donahue's family where they were sitting in court, and he launched into the apology that you've started to describe. He said, I pray every day that God has provided you with, comfort that helps you deal with your pain. Not a day goes by that I don't think about these deaths. He got choked up as he was saying it. It was hard sitting in court not to be a bit cynical, having heard about all the ways over the years in which John Morris has changed his story and protected himself. I mean, John Morris did no jail time for his malfeasance in the FBI. I didn't feel like I was watching an incredibly genuine apology. That's debatable, very subjective thing. But after court wrapped for the day, Tommy Donahue, one of Michael Donahue's children, said that he wasn't impressed by Morris's apology at all, and as he put it, that Morris could shove it. That was the phrase he used.
And I get that. I get that about Morris. The reporters in the Spotlight team, we have a history with Morris and some of the other FBI agents having done all this reporting in the 1980s. And I do have to say this. I mean, Morris, we now know, is a deeply corrupted, deeply weak and flawed man. But there's something he's trying to do that very few others in this sordid saga, and that is apologize. And I think and I know this may sound like a counterpoint here a bit, that I think he has a conscience in a way that few others have in this story, and certainly not Whitey Bulger, and certainly not John Connolly, and certainly not the psychopaths who make up this world. That's not to defend him in any way for all that he's done and the harm he, John Morris, has caused. But
you think there's some genuine contrition?
I do, but it just doesn't play because of all the moments when he could have done the right thing and he did the wrong thing.
Don't you also wonder if maybe the apology is for the fact that he's been caught? You know, I mean, he's sorry. He's genuinely sorry that he's gotten caught up in...
Yeah, that's part of what makes him so reprehensible. Is that he had so many opportunities to do right, and instead he kept doing wrong, and that's what makes him...
And that was a point. The defense really hammered that point today, because, you know, they're trying to tear down his credibility just the way they tried to tear down the credibility of John Martirano, who's, you know, confessed his participation in 20 murders and has now turned state's witness. And they kept hammering home the point again and again over 3 days of cross-examination. You know, you took gifts of, you know, $1,000, $5,000 from Bulger and Flemmi. You let them buy a plane ticket for your then mistress, now wife, who's got one of my favorite all-time names, Deborah Noseworthy. You know, you cooked dinner for them in your apartment. There was a really absurd and hilarious moment today where Hank Brennan, one of Bulger's attorneys, talked about Morris, you know, strapping on an apron to cook dinner for Bulger and Flemmi when they came over with Connolly. And Morris kind of bristled. He said, "Well, I'm not sure that I was wearing an apron." You know, so maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But the implication, obviously, is that he was kind of subservient to these guys, a flunky.
And it would have been appropriate if he had been wearing an apron.
There was another moment today that was pretty striking, which is when a gentleman named... yes, where Bulger laughed. You're talking about his total lack of a conscience. Bulger began laughing during the testimony of a guy named Joseph Tower, who was a former coke dealer from Southie, who had connected with Bulger and was using him for protection. In the course of his drug trafficking, Tower's brother ended up going to collect on a huge drug debt that had not yet been paid, and he was taken prisoner in Lynn and put on the phone, told his brother Joseph that, you know, these guys are threatening to kill me. They say we're not going to get the money, and they said they're going to execute me. And as Tower recounted this today, he got very emotional. You know, you could tell this was sort of a traumatic experience for him. And as he got emotional, Bulger was sitting guffawing at this tale that was being told. And when testimony wrapped for the day, I caught a glimpse of Bulger's face, and he looked like he just heard the best joke anyone had ever told him. He was beaming, and I felt like I was watching kind of sociopathy incarnate. You know,
absolutely. For him, it's like recapping and reconstructing a ball game or something. You know, a great play or something like that. For him, that's what that stuff is.
That's
really
scary.
troubling.
Sometimes
chilling.
It's really hard to tell who the bad guy is. That was one of the questions that I had for MacDonald was, you know, who really is the bad guy here, the FBI or Whitey? And he thought they were pretty much equal. What would you say?
Well, you know, yeah, they're all bad. I mean, in terms of those corrupted agents that Whitey had, whose power Whitey had harnessed. For sure. But the one where I've always been, you know, Whitey was born to be bad. I mean, he's the bad guy. You expect him to be bad. I think the bigger horror for us and our nation is the work of all these FBI agents who you expect to be upholding the law and public safety, and in fact they were undermining it.
Just briefly along those lines, Tommy Donahue, the son of one of the victims, said outside court today that it's incredibly difficult for his family to watch what's going on because they want justice for Bulger, but they feel like it's Bulger's attorneys who are digging up the full truth of what exactly went on.
That's how they're getting the real information.
Right.
They're not getting it, ironically, from the government.
And he said it's very difficult to watch that and try to reconcile those two things.
Yeah.
Well, we will continue to be watching it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
And thank you again for your insight. A reminder to stay tuned to WGBH for continuing coverage of the Whitey Bulger trial right here on Greater Boston, as well as on 89.7 WGBH Radio and WGBHnews.org.